Dobroveče, onda možemo polako da krenemo sa večerašnjim otvaranjem. I will talk in Serbian for the beginning to welcome everybody. Dear Director of Austrian Cultural Forum, dragi poštovani državni sekretaru Ministarstva nauke, tehnološkog razvoja i inovacija, poštovani učesnici kafea iz Austrije i Srbije, poštovani predstavnici medija, dragi gosti naučnog kluba, dobrodošli u Centar za promociju nauke. Drago nam je jako i veliko zadovoljstvo da možemo danas da otvorimo i ugostimo seriju naučnih kafea, koja će u stvari prikazati najbolje prakse i iskustva saradnje između Austrije i Srbije i u oblasti nauke, ali više o tome će vam svakako reći gospodin Adrijan Fajks. Ja bih danas želela u stvari da vam kažem nešto više o našem naučnom klubu, o prostoru u kome se sada ovde svi nalazimo. Naime, mi smo ovog aprila proslavili naš 6. rođendan naučnog kluba i mi volimo da kažemo da je ovo prostor u stvari koji je otvoren za sve, za razmenu, za ideje i koji je prostor koji je zapravo i namenjen da bude domaćin različitim manifestacijama i događajima naučno-popularnog karaktera i to su različiti formati potpuno u pitanju, od sastanaka preko predavanja, izložbi, radionica, zatim seminara, konferencija i tako dalje, ali ono što je sve njih zajedno povezuje jesu da su u pitanju različite oblasti nauke i da su tu učesnici svi oni koji su zainteresovani za nauku. Naučni klub je mesto, kao što sam rekla, koje spaja sve zaljubljenike u nauke bez obzira na njihov uzrast, na nivo znanja i oblast interesovanja i to je mesto koje je za sve od učenika, njihovih nastavnika i nastavnica, zatim studenta, različitih inženjera, naučnika, do mejkera i umetnika koji koriste ovaj prostor na različite načine. Ono što je, još jedno što sam želela da kažem, jeste da se zahvaljujemo našem dugogodišnjem partneru i saradniku i Austrijskom kulturnom u stvari forumu koji je baš izabrao nas da nastavimo ovu saradnju i da kod nas budemo u stvari domaćini ove serije naučnih kafea koji će se odvijati u nekoliko narednih meseci. Svakako ja ne bih dalje dužila, već bih vas još jednom toplo, požela bih vam toplu dobrodošlicu kod nas u naučni klub i želim vam da uživate i da svakako dođete i na ostala događanja. Hvala. Državnog sekretara da vam se obrati.
Hvala. Izvinite što smo ovako formalni, ja bih volao da probamo da ostanemo neformalni, iako sam ja u delu, ja idem pravo sa posla, inače bih ja došao malo opušteniji danas, iako sam i formalno državni sekretar. Meni je samo, kažem, drago da sam danas ovde i da sam pogledao koja je tema, pokušat ću da ostanem koliko god je moguće, da čujem ovu temu imajući u vidu da je jedini ERC, mislim, odnosno među prvim ERC grantovima koje smo mi dobili kao zemlja upravo bilo na temu arheologije i projekat Birth. Za sada, i kada smo pogledali malo statistiku, izgleda da mi tu možemo mnogo više. U pitanju su samo 3 ERC-a koje je dobila Srbija, kada pogledamo broj istraživača i sve, kao da nismo to dovoljno ispromovisali. S tim u vezi krenuli smo sa Fondom za nauku, ozbiljno da napravimo poseban program za one ljude koji su aplicirali i prošli u narednu fazu, da automatski mogu da se prijave kod fonda po nekom principu Seal of Excellence i da onda obezbede sebi finansiranje, da podstaknemo ljude tako da što više apliciraju za ERC i da onda kasnije i dobiju te projekte. Tako da to nam je namera da postignemo u narednom periodu. Druga stvar važna jeste da, pošto sada nekako kada su razdvojena ministarstva, imamo više prilike da se posvetimo konkretnim temama, a to je promocija. Promocija nauke, promocija inovacija, promocija istraživanja i evo hvala Centru za promociju nauke što zajednički radimo na ovom sada sajmu tehnike koji će trajati od 16. do 19. maja, pa evo i prilika da vas i ovako sve pozovem. Ideja je da zapravo tamo naši naučni instituti, odnosno naučno-istraživačke organizacije i fakulteti predstave šta je to na što su oni najviše ponosni, na čemu oni rade i šta je to što trebaju zapravo naši stanovnici da vide i da se upoznaju i da shvate u smislu kakva nas budućnost očekuje u narednom periodu i šta je to na čemu naši naučni instituti rade i zbog čega mi njih plaćamo i zbog čega imamo toliki broj istraživača. Nekako kao da nauka nije postala dovoljno vidljiva. Imamo i projekat e-nauka, verovatno ako ste iz nauke znate kako to funkcioniše, trenutno popunjavate repozitorijom i sve. To će nam pomoći da već od juna imamo kompletne podatke o naučnoj produkciji i da tačno znamo koja institucija koliko produkuje, koji istraživač koliko produkuje i da na taj način imamo mnogo transparentniji sistem za kašnjenje nagrađivanja. I would just also welcome you coming to Belgrade and to Serbia, and we are very pleased that you came and that you will present your research to our community. And this is, as I understand, one of the sessions that will be held in the next period. Today we're speaking about archaeology, then we'll speak about demography, which is very important for the Serbia, and climate change as well. Hvala na tome. Predajem vam mikrofon da nastavimo sa programom.
Hvala lepo. Ja ću ipak na engleskom, obično na srpskom, ali danas, zato što ćemo pričati na engleskom, ja ću također na engleskom. Dear Director, dear Marjana, dear State Secretary, dear guests from the scientific community, journalists, and interested public, it's a great pleasure always to be here. And this time it's a particular pleasure because we are starting something that I hope will be successful, will be interesting to the public, will be interesting to the science community, and will be also interesting to the institutions dealing with science. As we just heard, Serbia now has a dedicated ministry for science, and your presence here is definitely a sign that you are aware of the importance of international connections and of Austria, and thank you very much again for this, and I'm sure we'll be able to deepen the connection. And this is one part. So the concept of the Science Cafe, as we thought of it, and we talked about it with the Center for the Promotion of Science, is to have a relatively relaxed atmosphere to talk about really high-level, excellent science. And this is science from Austria and science from Serbia. And in this case, it's particularly interesting because there is also a direct connection somehow in an umbrella project between the speakers that we have here. It will not always be like this, but this is something that shows that the scientific connections that many of you know about between Austria and Serbia that go back to Nikola Tesla. Maybe you know he was in Graz. Milutin Milankovic was in Vienna. We have Jovan Cvijic, who was also in Vienna. So these are the big names of Serbian science in the 19th, 20th century. But it definitely doesn't stop here. And our job, my job also, is to make sure that, to be honest, not to make sure that it continues, because it continues anyway by itself, but to make sure that we highlight it here and there and show it to a broader public, and also see how we can build upon this to make your scientific community and ours more connected and more productive. So I will not give much more of an introduction to this concept. I hope the format will speak for itself, and we'll have two presentations, more or less half an hour each, and then time for discussion. So that's the concept, and with this I will now change my role and sit down and talk about, just very briefly introduce our guest from Austria, Valter Pol. He is maybe one of the most important, definitely most renowned historians in Austria. I would not be able to give you a full CV, just very briefly. Recently retired as professor for medieval history at the University of Vienna and as director of the Institute for Medieval Research at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Last year, he's a project leader, and he will tell you more about this, of the ERC Sinergy grant, Histogenes, that runs from 2020 to 2026. This is one of these very large ERC projects. And among other things, he worked on the transformation of the Roman world, post-Roman kingdoms, on ethnicity in this early medieval period, steppe peoples, as well as on early medieval Italy. His books, countless articles and a number of monographies. Books include the Avars and monographies about early Germans, and as far as I understood, this was also kind of a controversial topic, the topic of what are Germans and what is identity of these tribes and so on. Maybe we can talk about it later. The migration period, as well as the early medieval monastery of Monte Cassino. So thank you very much, Professor, for being here with us, and the floor is yours. I think you have a microphone, or should I?
Yes, should work. Do you hear me? Yes, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the friendly introductions. So I'm going to talk about a project in which we collaborate between Vienna, the Austrian Academy, and the Institute for Archaeology of the Academy of Sciences here in Belgrade, and also working on a period in which we have a lot of shared history to study. So there were Roman towns on the Danube, Limes, Vienna, and Vindobona and Singidunum, and then we were all part of the Avar Khaganate and had a share in its fall. I want to briefly present three parts of my little presentation to you. First part is about the use of archaeogenetics, its wonderful potential for scholarship, but also its limits. The second part will be a very brief overview of the historical period that we study from the 5th to the 9th century. And the third part will be about the Histogenes project and about the first results that we already have. Now, genetics, what you see here is an ad by one of the companies that ask you to send in a drop of blood or something, and they give you your genome and tell you who you are. In this case, and they want to set you off in that interest by all these ancient peoples. There's also, are you a Roman? Are you a Viking? Are you a Slav? Etc. Can genetics tell us who we really are? Now, one thing that is really flawed, apart from the fact that I wouldn't advise you to do this because it's bad enough that all these companies have all this big data about us and what we do on the internet. But if they have your genome, they can sell it to a lot of people who might it's your future employer, the company that sells you coverage for your illnesses, etc. But what is certainly flawed is the promise to identify you, or whoever is analyzed here, with the people of the distant past. If only to a certain percentage, Vikings, Goths, and Romans are, of course, popular, but certainly not genetically uniform. They were mixed already, and already for more than 2,000 years, the population of Europe was genetically actually very homogeneous, with a few exceptions like the Basques and the Sardinians. So they're actually quite hard to distinguish. And what geneticists have also noticed is that genetic difference increases with distance, geographical distance, which is logical because usually people look for their wives, or the other way around, if you want, in the proximity and not from far away. So they don't conform to national boundaries either. So maybe not, but archaeogenetics can help us to find out more about some historical questions that we might have about people in the past. There are more interesting questions to ask about the past than who may be descended from anybody long ago today, biologically. There has been enormous progress in methods to extract ancient DNA, so the DNA of individuals from the past, from bones or from teeth. That's actually for historical periods where differences are not that big, a very recent achievement. And what has also made wonderful progress are bioinformatic methods to actually make sense of these data, because the sequencing data of a genome by themselves don't tell you very much. But if you have all these very sophisticated algorithms, then you can actually find out much more about this. So, for instance, geneticists can explore biological relatedness up to the 3rd and to some extent to the 6th degree, and they can construct all these wonderful pedigrees, which you will see later. They can find out about ancestries, how they call groups from which an individual is to some extent descended, and usually that is already a mixture of different peoples or groups they are descended from. They can calculate or find out about this admixture in the present and in the past, so processes in which groups of people mix. And all people in historical periods are genetically mixed. And they can allow us to trace migratory movements and the impact on the population in the target area. So how does migration change the composition of the population in the area? And they can also trace pandemics and other diseases, and also the evolution of pathogens responsible for them. So these pathogens, of course, evolve genetically much, much faster than humans, because, of course, the lifespan is so different. And that can change, as we have all witnessed during COVID, actually in a very short period. So, of course, there are things that geneticists cannot tell us. So they can tell us nothing at all about human races. Human races are essentially, as the Jena Declaration by leading geneticists a few years ago stated, they're an invention of racists in the 19th century. They have no biological or genetic basis, so cannot be found in the genes. They cannot tell you which ethnic group or nation somebody actually, an individual of the past, actually belonged to, or which language he or she spoke. So members of ethnic groups may very well be biologically related, but it's also possible that they were not. So there is constant change that is not identical with the biological admixture. And the same thing regards kinship and belonging to a family. Now, of course, that is related to a considerable degree, but for instance, if we find out that a child buried in a cemetery from the Ava period is descended from a father and a mother who may be buried elsewhere, we cannot be sure whether these father and mother were actually married and whether people at the time actually knew who the father was. So that is only one reason why this may be different. And social anthropologists tell us that there are ways to take up somebody not biologically related into a family, in some societies more, in some less. They cannot exactly date migrations to a certain year, for instance, so historians are often more precise in these datings, and also archaeologists are usually more precise. They have ways to calculate the average period, the likely period when this happened, but not the precise date. And of course, in general, geneticists cannot really decide about the historical interpretation of their data. And it's very important, I think, that historians, archaeologists take part in this process, in the sort of enthusiasm about the rapid progress of genetical methods. Geneticists have also tried to interpret their own data, and usually that is something that historians or archaeologists meet with a bitter smile. Oh, how did he get that idea? So that is something our project is now really doing, involving all disciplines concerned. So this is very much an interdisciplinary question. New chances, new risks, wonderful potential, fascinating new methods, but also the risk that there is no established method yet in much that concerns the interpretation. Historical conclusions from genetic data have not really kept pace with the potential that is in acquiring the data. And there is also a problem that in many countries, national identity politics are trying to exploit genetic research to confirm some sort of national ideologies. So there is a great interest in Hungary to find out the real origin of the Hungarians in a period far, far in the past. That's usually not very good for genetics, and it's not very good for the public to be told kind of scientific truths that might not be so self-evident. So we need to develop better methods for the historical interpretation of genetic evidence. Now, the period in which we are trying to find new ways for integrated interdisciplinary research is one of the most interesting periods in European history, I think. A formative period of Europe, so roughly from the period of the late Roman Empire, which you see on the map to the left, so an empire that still controlled all the coasts of the Mediterranean and Europe up to the Rhine and Danube River. So Vindobona and Singidunum, Vienna and Belgrade also share that position on the boundary that ran right through Europe. And it was also until the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne, which tried once again to pick up the Roman tradition, but did not really succeed in the long term. This was a period in which most of the peoples that we have in Europe now, most of the nations were first mentioned, or at least reached the region where they still settled: the English, the French, the Danes, the Bulgarians, the Serbs, Croats, Hungarians, and many others. And it witnessed a historical transition from antiquity, ancient empires, to the Middle Ages, when Europe began to be composed of a multitude of kingdoms and states. So let me briefly guide you through this period before I talk about our research project. So this is the Roman Danube between roughly Vindobona, Vienna, which is up here, and so Singidunum, we still see Viminatium, and I have two reconstruction of Carnuntum, which was actually bigger, close to Vienna, which was actually bigger than Vienna in the Roman period, and of Sirmium, which was for a while more important than Singidunum in the late Roman period. Then there is the migration period, and you see here a kind of romanticizing presentation of Germanic people entering the Roman Empire, as compared to a historicizing presentation of the Exodus. So biblical motives also play a role in styling this migration always. There is still a lot of debate in scholarship among historians and archaeologists why the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century. We know, of course, that numerous barbarian groups crossed the Roman border to fight for or against the Romans, or both in turn, and enter into business. But it's important to remember that these were not the original nations, stable units, but they were peoples in the making. The composition changed during migrations, and we have historical sources to show that, and so did their historical fates. Some of the kingdoms they constructed were actually pretty short-lived, like the one of the Huns. So that was one important event that sparked off a lot of movement in the period. These were steppe warriors coming from somewhere in Central Asia who arrived all of a sudden north of the Black Sea in 375 and created some havoc among the Goths. After that, they only slowly built an impressive empire with its center between the Danube and the Tisa rivers. And there, famous King Attila resided in his wooden palace and launched a number of devastating raids, first to the Balkan provinces of the Roman Empire, and then to Gaul and to Italy. When he died in 453, the empire broke up very soon, and we have a different geography, and that is the situation in 520. So you see Ostrogoths in Italy and Visigoths in Spain and the Frankish kingdom that is emerging in Gaul. But you also see Gepids, which are on the east side of the Danube, and also Lombards already waiting to come to the Carpathian Basin. So what is specific about the area we're talking about is that in most other parts of the former Western Roman Empire, perhaps with the exception of Britain, most of the Roman infrastructure was in fact preserved. There were still towns, the sort of organization of agriculture, trade, if to a reduced extent, still worked. And that is different in Pannonia, where only a few cities survived for a while, and the whole Roman system had somehow gone. And a succession of migrants and peoples took turns in erecting their kingdoms there. And then in 568, the Lombards, who had been west of the Danube in Pannonia, moved to Italy, and this was the hour when the Avars arrived in the region, and they obviously came from Eastern Central Asia, built their empire with the residents between Danube and Tisa like the Huns before them. And also started to raid, only in the Balkan provinces, not so much in the west. And after a long siege of Sirmium in 580 to 582, they actually captured this very important place, which had been imperial residence of the Roman Empire for a while. And 626, they even besieged Constantinople, and in vain. And the Byzantines regarded that as a kind of miracle, that the Virgin Mary had protected the city, and the famous Orthodox chant, the Hymnos Akathistos, was actually composed in that occasion for the protection of the city. And this was the end of the Avar offensives. The empire persisted until the Frankish armies of Charlemagne crushed it in around 800. So here is another slide showing you that not only Avars started raiding the Balkan provinces in the second half of the 6th century and in the early 7th, but also Slavs living at the time north of the Danube, but also already in the Carpathian basins. So what you see in red is, well, I took it from the internet, and not all the dates are quite exact, but to give you an impression how all these important cities disappear at some point in this area. And that leads to the big question of Slavic expansion. Now here you see a very conventional way of presenting sort of one area where all these Slavs came from and how they spread across most of Eastern Europe. And that is still open, what really happened in the period. What we do know is that in the course of the 6th to at the latest 9th century, much of Eastern Europe became Slavic, and that these Slavs are very difficult to trace. So initially they hardly produced any lasting goods apart from simple pottery. They also cremated their dead, so unfortunately we can take no genetic samples from them. And we have some historical news about them, but not all that much. So the question is, was that actually an expansion from any given Slavic homeland, or was this rather a process in which people already living in some areas became Slavs, took up the Slavic language and Slavic ways of life? So of course the Slavs had the great, gave the great opportunity that they didn't tax, they didn't extract any dues from the people who worked the land. So that might have been quite popular. This is only one of the big questions that we still have about the formative period of Europe. And with this, I come to the project. This is a project funded by the European Research Council, ERC. It's called the Sinergy grant, and there is really a lot of money in that. We it started in 2020, and we're exactly in half of it. So on the 1st of May, we'll have 3 years. We'll have 3 more to 26. The main project partners are the Austrian Academy and the University of Vienna, then the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. Johannes Krauss is one of the directors next to Svante Pääbo, who got the Nobel Prize for his archaeogenetic work last year. And then there's Patrick Geary from the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, who is another historian, and the archaeologist Tiva Davida from the University of Budapest, and also a number of other people. And of course, as we will see, we have a lot of contacts. The case study is Eastern Central Europe in the 5th to 9th century, and that not only tells us something important about this very interesting area, but it's also interesting because it's probably the region in Europe at the time with the most population shifts and with the most political changes. About 20 different peoples named in the sources: Romans, Goths, Huns, Longobards, Gepids, Avars, Bulgars, Slavs, Franks, and actually many more. And we also have an exceptional wealth of burial evidence. So over 100,000 graves that have been excavated. And actually, because these are countries with strong archaeologists and strong archaeological institutes, and we're very grateful for all these countries that fund these institutes. So they're all well documented. There's a lot of publication, so that is material easy to work with, unlike some Western European countries where this kind of research is not possible anymore. So this is a model project, I think, also for other regions. This is an ideal region and an ideal period to actually try out how geneticists, archaeologists, historians, and of course anthropologists and further disciplines can collaborate. The aim is, because we have 3 different types of sources: textual sources that describe emerging peoples and their migrations, archaeological finds that allow tracing groups of cultural habitus, and genetic clusters that show biological relations. Different types of evidence, and the challenge is to actually balance these different types of information and make them fit. Not easy, but very interesting. And one thing that it can help us to find out is how these local communities worked in the time. So gain insights about kinship, sex and gender, role of women, social status, hierarchies, incidents of war and violence, nutrition, working conditions, health and diseases, etc. Here we are with all the areas that we are going to study and want to find out how population and social structure changed. So we are taking more than 6,000 samples from circa 100 cemeteries in 8 countries, and 6,000 samples is dimensions beyond any previous archaeogenetic project. So usually they have done dozens or at most a few hundred samples, and we're also collaborating with all these 8 countries to arrive at relatively broad comparison and also to establish a body of reference for future genetic study. We still have to also take modern DNA for comparison to locate some of our finds, but we hope to go beyond that in a few years. Here are a first published result that we found out, and that is the origin of the avars. Actually, since the 6th century, there was debate where these avars came from, because one Byzantine writer claimed these are not real avars, these are pseudo-avars. They don't even come from Eastern Central Asia, where the powerful empire of the Roran was before. They are just from around the corner, and they just pretend they are the famous avars. Now, what we got is good evidence that shows that in princely graves, elite graves between Danube and Tisa in the 7th century, these are really Eastern Asians. So they come from really far away. What you get here is one of the things that geneticists do. They have two axes which represent two parts of the genome that are really different from each other among the population. And then they plot first modern samples, and that gives you a rough map of Eurasia with Europe on the left and Eastern Asia on the right, and there's Southeast Asia bottom right. And then they plot the colorful dots are samples that we took from the Carpathian Basin. And there are some things that are not avar elite graves from the period, sort of graves from Pannonia. We plot on the western side, so these are Europeans, but the red dots are all the elite graves. For instance, Gumbabon, the richest avar graves, which is attributed to a Kagan. And that is some of the finds from this grave. It's a lot of gold in it. So we know that these people come from really far away and are genetically really different. And that is methodologically very interesting for a second reason, because they're so different that we can study admixture when they come to Europe in a very precise way. If they had been rather similar in the first place, you couldn't study the process of admixture as they are here so well. So that is what we're really interested in. I'm going to show you a second example, which is unpublished. So you get the news before the news is published. And these are mainly two and a part of a third cemetery south of Vienna, Mödling and Leobersdorf at a distance of 15-20 kilometers, and part of a third one in Vienna, in the outskirts of Vienna, Czokogase, which we have analyzed. And Mödling and Leobersdorf we have analyzed entirely, which is a wonderful method, because only analyzing the entire cemetery allows you to actually see all relations, biological relatedness and social structure, and really reconstruct it. So these are both late Avar period cemeteries, late 7th to 8th and perhaps early 9th centuries. So they have a very characteristic cultural outfit. So this is Leobersdorf, and what you see here is very typical for the late Avar age. You find it from northern Serbia to eastern Austria and even beyond. These are bronze cast, in this case gilt, belt fittings of multiple belts which have these side straps hanging down. And they also have very typical motifs. So this griffin motif is very current and sometimes practically identical in the middle of the 8th century. And then you have, also look at that earring, that's also typical of the period. And then we have Mödling, which also has this, also gilt in this case, wonderful belt set, and also the earring that looks pretty similar. So this is archaeologically clearly the same kind of groups of cultural finds. Now, the great surprise that we had was, where's my, I'm missing the plot. I had a PCA plot in here that I lost somehow, that showed a similar structure as the first one, where you saw the red dots in the east and the other dots in the west. And what turned out is that the inhabitants from Leopoldorf still had that Eastern Asian ancestry, whereas the people in the Mödling cemetery were Europeans. So same cultural outfit, great genetic difference. That is interesting in itself because it shows that, and I think that is a pilot example in archaeology, that the biological identity and the cultural identity do not necessarily overlap or correspond. They can be very different. So biology does not determine culture, and as humanities scholars, we're all very glad to have found proof of that. So the question, of course, is why can that be that 200 years plus minus after the immigration of a group coming from Eastern Central Asia, they still have preserved that Eastern Asian ancestry? Because what we found is, and here is a part of one of the pedigrees that the geneticists can reconstruct. You see that it's 6 generations, and the empty forms, dots, quadrangles are people that we do not have in the cemetery, but that we can reconstruct genetically. The circles are the women, and I have marked in red the mothers, all the mothers in that part of the pedigree. None of these mothers have any ancestors in the cemetery, so they come from another place. Incest or marrying within the group cannot explain that they preserved their biological identity, which means that this must have been a deliberate cultural practice to go out and find a woman. Well, we don't even know whether these women look different. They didn't dress differently because that would have reflected in the graves. They may have spoken a different language. They may have told different stories, and they may have been attractive for other reasons. We don't know. It may simply be an expression that certain communities traditionally intermarried. What we, I think, can safely assume is that these men from Leopoldorf did not sit on their horse, ride to Eastern Central Asia and got a bride from there. It's a bit far away. That shows us that there are cultural practices that can explain biological relatedness and not the other way around. And so these things interact. There is a lot more to explore. So what you see here is the Vienna team working with a printout of the Mödling pedigree. So Mödling 500 graves. Most of these people are somehow related to each other. And because it's on the spreadsheet, it is difficult to work with. We printed it out and it's 5 meters long. So this is how all these people are related with each other. And now the archaeologists can work with it and see who has belt sets and who is related. So is there a difference between parts of these pedigrees? Can we find overlaps between the social and the biological relatedness? So there's a lot of questions. And on the whole, a lot of more questions that we want to explore. This is actually a wonderful code clasp from Mödling showing 2 archers. So the gradual dissolution of the Roman Empire and its impact along the Middle Danube. So in a way, the many ends of antiquity. And this is what we hear more about in a minute. Or did the successive migrations in the 5th, 6th centuries actually lead to fundamental population shifts, or were there only changes in a ruling elite and the basic population of the region stayed behind, maybe changed their cultural outfit? How did large parts of Eastern Europe become Slavic? We talked about that. What remained of the Avars? So they disappear from the written sources in the early 9th century. Does that mean that they were all killed, were all gone away, or that they had simply become Slavs, which we suspect they did, but we have to find out? And of course, how did conditions of life change in general in the course of the period? How did the people live in a sort of relatively simple rural society? How did they change from nomadic ways of life to sedentary ways of life? And how did population changes reflect on basic ways of life? So thank you for your attention, and I hand over to the Serbian colleagues.
Thank you. Maybe I will also introduce our guests from Serbia very, very briefly, because I guess many of you already know them. We have, as you said, we will hear something about, I think, a little bit of an earlier period of the Roman reoccupation, if I understood correctly, after the Hunnic destruction. So we have with us Vujadin Ivanišević, who worked at the Institute of Archaeology in Belgrade. Also, in his research interests include the study of urbanism, late antiquity, the migration period, and Middle Ages, and in particular the early Byzantine period. We had the opportunity to hear something last time at the Austrian Embassy about this early Byzantine period. If I remember correctly, it was fascinating. And in particular, of course, the city of Grad, which I think you were the director of for many years. And we have with us also Ivan Bugarski, an archaeologist, also dealing with a range of topics from early Byzantine and early medieval archaeology, landscape archaeology and prospection, with a PhD in the field of Avar archaeology. So there is a clear connection here. And since 2002 at the Institute of Archaeology, participated in numerous excavations here, and since 2023, the director of Grad. So thank you very much for being here, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Evo, kolega Bugarski će da predstavi, I will speak in Serbian, će predstaviti naš zajednički rad. Ja ću samo htio da se zahvalim Austrijskom kulturnom forumu na pozivu i naravno Centru, što imamo priliku da prikažemo jedan od većih projekata, ERC projekata koji se bavi upravo istraživanjem ovih naših prostora. Mi učestvujemo sa dva lokaliteta, to je Sirmium i Singidunum, gde upravo ćemo raditi ta istraživanja koja će biti vezana za antičku populaciju, odnosno kasnu antičku populaciju i naravno one sve koji su u međuvremenu naselili ove prostore, o čemu će Ivan pričati, i koji su naselili. I ovaj deo što ste videli, ovo će biti jedna klasična arheološka priča, odnosno istorijska, i nadam se da ćemo za godinu dana biti u prilici da predstavimo potpune rezultate istraživanja genetičkog materijala iz Sirmijuma sa našim kolegama koji rade u Arheološkom institutu i Singidunuma, gde ćemo imati priliku da upravo uporedimo, da vidimo koji su ta bila pomeranja i kako možemo da ocenimo u nekim zadnjim, odnosno projektima koji su bili do sada objavljeni. Rezultati pokazuje dosta ono što arheološki materijal takođe pokazuje, što ovde govorimo, to je da postoji ta jaka, u stvari, jedna selidba sa severa Evrope, odnosno sa prostora Skandinavije, i da vidimo koliko je bio impakt tih selidbi, što vidimo nešto u arheološkom materijalu do sada, ali to će u svakom slučaju, ja mislim, dobro da potvrdi ili da opovrgne upravo ova analiza koja se radi, znači kompletnog DNK materijala, tako da očekujemo dosta podataka ili ćemo naravno potvrditi ono što da sada arheološki i istorijski izvori govore, da smo vidjeli da ovde za prostor Avara je zaista dokazano da oni dolaze s tog prostora daleke istočne Azije. Znači, ovdje imamo neke podatke, imamo dosta podataka, tako da mislim da će to biti jedan veliki pomak, zato što će, recimo, nekih 250 individua je analizirano iz Sirmijuma i Singidunuma. To je nekropola Singidunumska, koja će biti, nešto kratko reći, se nalazi nekih 150 metara odavde zapadno. To je na prostoru Tadeuša Košćuška, gde je ona istražena 90. godina i tu je negde oko nekih 40-ak skeleta istraživano, tako da ćemo vidjeti u stvari koji su bili prethodnici, koji su stanovali u Singidunu u Beogradu. Imaćemo neke, da kažem, prave podatke, a sad bih zamolio Ivana da prikaže ono što arheologija može i istorija da odgovori, naš jedan klasičan metod, a za godinu dana nadam se da ćemo predstaviti pune rezultate.
Hvala. Ja bih samo pre toga također želeo da zahvalim organizatorima i naravno svim kolegama koji su došli i gostima i da još jednom izrazim zaista veliko zadovoljstvo što smo u prilici da budemo deo tako jednog velikog i važnog projekta kao što je HistoGenes i naravno što smo u prilici da ugostimo našeg dragog kolegu i Valtera Pola i da prosto ponovo razgovaramo sa njim. To je za nas zaista od vrlo velike važnosti. And now I will continue in English. Well, with its frontier cities and fortifications on the Danube, northern Illyricum underwent drastic changes with the Gothic incursions of the end of the 4th and the 5th centuries. Despite the efforts of Emperor Theodosius II in the defense of the Balkan provinces, particularly evident between 410 and 425, the settlement of the Goths as federati was followed by movements, attacks, and further settlement of other peoples, which all culminated in the early 440s with Hunnic operations led by Attila. Both the old legionary camps and the smaller fortifications along the Danube, which you can see here, were to lose their importance. Between the 5th and the 7th centuries, Germanic peoples were settled on both banks of the Danube, either as Roman enemies or as their mercenaries. There were three phases of their presence in the region within this span. Hunnic domination period was followed by that of Gepidic predominance, with 454 as a turning point, and the year 567-568, when the Avars established their rule in the Carpathian Basin, represents another critical moment in the history of barbarian presence in the region. And we should underscore that the term barbarian and barbarians is here used to label non-Roman newcomers of different origins, notably Germanic, and of their material culture. Now, even if their overall number is not very high, and the sites producing them are not sufficiently explored and published, the finds of such material culture, the bulk of which came from cemeteries, are illustrative of the changes that were taking place in the Central Balkans and particularly along the Danube limes. On this occasion, we will present some of the most characteristic possessions and status symbols of Germanic federati, their weapons, from both graves and the habitation layers in which they were found. From west to east, our survey starts in the Sirmia region, where the Gepidic presence is recorded by historical sources, particularly in Sirmium itself. One could perhaps assign to them also the finds, including a spatha from damaged grave at Rakovac. On the other hand, the area of the city of Basiane in the southeastern corner of the Sirmia region remained within the empire. From this part of Sirmia, Jakovo, Batajnica, and Belegiš, came some well-known weapon graves. Out of 87 recorded graves at the large Kormadin cemetery in Jakovo, some 8 were warriors' graves. A well-known warrior graves has been unearthed at the Bekića Salaš site near Batajnica. The grave produced a Baldenheim-type helmet, corroded and fragmented spatha, lenticular spearhead, umbo, simple snaffle bits, and Germanic stamped pot. It has been attributed to a Gepid commander and dated to the middle of the 6th century, up to the year 567. Then, following 3 small migration period necropolises, the damaged cemetery of 105 graves, Singidunum III, was formed above the edge of the former urban core and at the fringes of the Roman necropolis. Dating from the end of the 4th to the end of the 6th or the beginning of the 7th century, it was probably the main city cemetery in the course of the migration period. Only 3 graves contained weapons. The buried were members of a heterogeneous barbarian group which settled in Singidunum in the middle and the second half of the 5th century and around the year 500. According to the written sources, by the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 6th century, the city with its surroundings was settled by Ostrogoths, Gepids and Heruli. The grave finds, typical of Germanic peoples successively settling along the Danube limes, and also those belonging to the Roman tradition, point to this kind of mixture, whether the buried were mercenaries or ruling class people. One of the latest burials at the site, coming from the time when the city was reclaimed by the empire, grave 6, may be attributed to the Federati. Situated at the confluence of the Danube and the Velika Morava River, Margum regained its importance during the crisis of the late Roman Empire, when a system of at least 2 fortifications on both banks of the Danube, Margum and Contra Margum, was established, controlling a natural crossing point over the river. Some intramural graves have been unearthed in the city, which contained characteristic Germanic pottery. And the burnished bottle, you can see them here, a spearhead and a sword. Furthermore, a total of 170 migration period graves have been recorded at 3 cemeteries in the immediate vicinity of Viminatium, once the prosperous capital of Upper Maesia. 43 graves at Viminatium I, or Burdelj Cemetery, 106 graves at Viminatium II, or Više grobalja, and 22 at Viminatium III, or Lanci. Grave 1607 from Viminatium II contained an umbo of the Liebenau type, datable to the end of the 4th and the first 2/3 of the 5th century, a triangular spearhead and 2 knives. A roughly 40-year-old male was buried in this simple grave. This individual could have been a member of the Federati garrison or perhaps one of those who conquered the city alongside Attila. On the other hand, graves from the 6th and the first decades of the 7th century are particularly important for our analysis. From the middle third of the 6th century came 9 graves with weapon finds. Illustrative is a simple inhumation, grave 1876, of a male aged around 40, which produced only a sword set. However, it was a rather luxurious set, including an 85-70 long double-edged spata, 2 silver sheet fittings, and amber pommel. Only 3 weapon graves have been ascribed to the period spanning the last third of the 6th and the first half of the 7th century. In grave 23 at Viminatium III, a 37 centimeters long reed-like spearhead has been found, together with parts of a typical Germanic belt set of Western European origin. Given its location, it is likely that this cemetery was used by the Federati garrison stationed at Svetinja, an early Byzantine fortification in the immediate vicinity of Viminatium, and perhaps the site of 6th century Viminacion. With the help of numismatic evidence, Germanic presence there has also been dated approximately to the last third of the 6th century. As for weaponry, a shield handle was found at Svetinja, together with 4 arrowheads. Especially important are the finds of at least 2 lamellar armors. The bulk of iron lamellae came from the floor of a smithy. They were found together with the folles of Emperor Maurice, minted in Constantinople in 587-8 and 590-91. And from the Balkan hinterlands, but apparently connected to the limes, we know of 2 Germanic burials from Kamenovo by Petrovac upon the Mlava River. Those graves of a warrior and a female were found among some Roman graves. The warrior's grave contained a lenticular spearhead, a scramasax, a laurel-shaped arrowhead, fragmented scissors, a knife, a stamped pottery vessel. The Kamenova graves were dated to the last 3rd or more likely to the middle of the 6th century. Recently, an ethnic interpretation was attempted of the 6th century Germanic finds from these parts, suggesting that most of the finds from Banat and Bačka across the Danube, not mentioned here, and including those post-dated 567 or 568, may be seen as Gepidic, as well as those from the western part of Sirmia. Yet, as it is apparent from the scarce written sources that during most of this period, the Gepids were enemies of the empire, it has been doubted if they were engaged in defending the Danube limes. On the other hand, the sources recorded that the Heruli had been settled within the empire, along the limes. This ethnic group was for decades engaged in military operations in Illyricum and Thrace, and also in the Persian, Vandal, and Italian campaigns of the empire. According to a well-informed contemporary, Marcellinus Comes, in the year 512, the Heruli crossed into the territory of the empire with the approval of Emperor Anastasius, and it is commonly believed that they settled in the area of Bassiane in Sirmia. Historical sources from the region of Emperor Justin I do not mention the Heruli. However, the news from the first year of Justinian's rule that they were given fertile lands and other possessions, while Justinian persuaded them to adopt Christian faith, speaks for their importance to the empire. As for the cities and areas of their settlement, Procopius mentions Singidunum in 2 instances. Certain groups of the Heruli were engaged in the Roman army, serving among other federati. In that capacity, they were most certainly obliged to protect the frontier and to take part in the defense of the empire from the other barbarian raids, as evidenced by their role in breaking a Slavic one from across the Danube, which took place after 545. Significant contingents of the Heruli took their share in the conquest of Africa, 1,000 of them, and Huns altogether, and especially of Italy. 2,000 men were recorded there in 538 and 3,000 mounted warriors in 552. The migration period cemeteries along the limes from Jakovo via Singidunum and Margum to Viminatium testify to the importance of barbarian settlement there, Herulic in particular. The finds from the southeastern corner of Sirmia may be assigned to them, although the Jakovo necropolis was labeled as Gepidic already in the title of an article by Danica Dimitrijević, and is still commonly attributed to them. The same could be true for the Batajnica grave and the 6th century Germanic finds from the Serbian Danube region, many of them surveyed here, and perhaps for those from the bridgeheads in southern Banat as well. We could not interpret with any certainty other finds from the Central Balkans. Although the hinterlands of present-day Serbia were never part of Gepid lands, Germanic finds from that area were assigned to them and interpreted in light of their movements after the 567 defeat. However, given the historical circumstances and the scarcity of precisely dated finds, we maintain reservation about such an attribution. It is important to underscore here that the proposed ethnic interpretation should be taken with some caution. It relies on knowledge of historical geography, namely of the detachment area of Herulic Federati. We have tried to present a sustainable model, avoiding the mixed argumentation by combining securely dated archaeological finds with historical geographical data. Like any other model, of course, this one could not be binding for all the cases. First of all, given the multi-layered character of the ethnogenesis of early medieval populations, historical ethnonyms are in fact labels for multilingual conglomerates assembled around the warrior core, gens, and weak consciousness was being spread among the rest on the basis of common interests, as Valter Pol repeatedly stated in his many books and articles. In that sense, not all the members of Herulic or Gepidic bands should be seen as of their particular origins. As the archaeological finds attributed to the former or the latter bear the same traits, our model should not be seen in a Cossinian way, but as an attempt to understand how far our sample might be aligned with a historical perspective. Serving directly under their leader, the Federati were not incorporated into regular units, nor did they have to be trained like regular soldiers. Our scant written sources do not tell much about heroic warfare practices. Yet, the little information from Justinian's times is in line with that from the previous period and stated that the Heruli fought lightly armed. Procopius wrote that they did not wear armor, helmets or corslets, but only a shield and the thick jackets instead. This may have contributed to their mobility and readiness to perform ambushes. The frequency with which they were called upon to serve in the imperial armies, moreover in different geographical conditions and against different opponents, and the responsibility given to their commanders point to their military strength. According to our evidence, the Federati were buried much like other Germanic peoples of that time, excluding the Lombards who, while still in the Carpathian Basin, laid plenty of arms in their graves. Equipped with weapons of their own production, like sexes, pathe, and possibly spear and arrowheads, and Byzantine manufacture, in fortifications along the Danube, they could also have used other types of weapons, such as, for example, reflex bows. After the second half of the 5th century, long sexes became few in context other than Gepidic. It is therefore not likely that they were of Byzantine make. The Baldachin type helmets were long believed to have been of Germanic origin. However, the finds from Tsarichingrad or Justiniana Prima and Heraclea Lynkestis testify to their Byzantine provenance and confirm their dating within the 6th century. Similarly, Western Merovingian origin is commonly suggested for ambows with silver rivets, also known from Gepid and Lombard contexts, and for accompanied shield handles. On the other hand, those pieces of weaponry have also been found in the early Byzantine Balkans, in present-day Turkey, in Mersin, Elaiusa Sebaste, and in Israel, Jerusalem Mamilla, and had even been depicted on a 6th century mosaic in Constantinople. By all appearances, lamellar armors from Svetinja are also Roman products. That those armors were valuable is evident from the fact that they were very seldom laid in prominent warriors' graves. Helmets of the Baldachin type were highly prestigious items as well. As noted by Herwig Wolfram, one such piece had the value of several villages. Out of almost 50 finds, many helmets came from the graves of Germanic military commanders who, judging by their spatial spread, were of Frank, Alemannic, Gepid, Lombard, and, if our suggestion were to be followed, Heruli descent. This is still a small number, of course, indicated that their role as symbols of rank or status may have been much more important than their role in war. Those may, of course, well have been diplomatic gifts. And now, a general problem in the study of weapon combinations is the issue of so-called grave-disturbing activities, or namely looting. Our colleague Alpar Dobos allowed for the possibility that the initial proportion of weapon burial in the late row grave cemeteries in Transylvania, roughly from this period, was in fact considerably higher than when excavated. And for comparison, out of 19 weapon graves at Viminatium II cemetery, 4 have been damaged. While we are aware that some of our contexts are, and some could be, incomplete, it is still worthwhile to investigate if they might have reflected Germanic or heroic warfare practices, or, in other words, if they represented functional weapon sets. Different opinions have been expressed concerning this issue. At first, Germanic weapon burials were used to reconstruct their standard weapon sets and fighting practice, implying that the weapons have been utilized by the deceased during their lifetime. Later scholarship, spearheaded by Heinrich Herke, was much more skeptical towards this simplified interpretation. One of the reasons is that not all weapons belonging to a deceased were laid into his grave. In general, the deposition of weapons in graves has something to do with wealth. But archaeology by itself cannot explain why some men have been buried with weapons and some others have not. These and other artifacts, archaeological burial data, were put into graves by the mourners and thus are intentional data, while functional data provide information about the actual life of the buried and are not affected or distorted by the burying community. They primarily came from physical anthropological analysis, crucially important to burial archaeology, which have revealed that some of the males buried in Anglo-Saxon weapon graves, for example, were too young, too old, or too sick to be warriors. In contrast to this, many individuals bearing the marks of fighting, including cut marks on the skull, have been buried without any weapons. Our sample shows, however, a different trend. Buried with weapons in either simple graves or coffins, men from Viminatium were all adults, and almost all aged between 30 and 50 years. The individual inhumed in grave 145, equipped with spatha and a full set of arrows, had an artificial deformed skull. Published anthropological analyses are not detailed enough to allow us to determine if some of those people, perhaps warriors, actually had battle wounds. But in our analysis, we can still lean on both intentional and, of course, to an extent, functional data. A weapon burial rite is, after all, a social phenomenon. In terms of individual burials and from the angle of contextual archaeology, the choice of armament deposited in a particular grave depicted how kin wished to remember the deceased, an image tempered by local custom and the amount of wealth that family members were willing or able to devote to the funeral ceremony. On a group level, and not contradicting this point, weapon burials served as an ethnic marker, underscoring the group's origin, which is one of the elements in the process of ethnic identity formation, and its differentiation from the local population. In this context, weapons were used as symbols of real or potential violence, and their display in a ritual projects an image of martial prowess and or power. On this, we can, of course, only agree with Herke, and to put aside the apparent disproportion in their size, it may well have been the reason that our sample differs from the Anglo-Saxon one in age structure and in displaying a higher ratio of offensive weapons. This is apparently so because the presented sample was not drawn from a sedentary population, either conquering or native, but instead represents the military corps around which the populace was formed, namely Justinian's mercenaries. At Viminatium II, more richly furnished women's burials of the same date cluster around the weapon graves in the northern part of the necropolis. One may suppose, of course, that these women were somehow related to prominent males. Successors of those were perhaps not Heruli. With the arrival of the Avars in 567, the Heruli disappeared from the written sources. But still, they maintained their gameful position until the end of the 6th or the beginning of the 7th century. The finds of lamellar armors from Svetinja speak for the garrison importance to the empire. And the vast share of amphorae found in pottery context there indicates that those mercenaries were involved in another lucrative activity, the distribution of goods, which came from the Annona. These observations bring us back to the assessment of the status of the most prominent individuals in our sample. First of all, the one from Batenica. In cultural anthropological terms, they can be labeled big men, or leaders that can receive their social position because of individual skills and actions, who act as redistributors of different goods. Big men keep their status in peace times because they control or manipulate the economical wealth of their community, above all by receiving money from the empire to pay and maintain the soldiers. After studying 6th century Germanic finds from the Upper Mysian limes, including both the settlement and funerary context, weapon graves in particular, we may conclude that our evidence reveals a clearly differentiated and internally stratified community with a privileged position derived from its role in the defense of the border and engagement in numerous military campaigns of the Roman Empire. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would now, since we're not behind time, actually, we just started a little bit late, but thank you for keeping the time also. I know it's always difficult, but we have some time for questions. I don't know if maybe I should start, or maybe we can immediately go to the audience if you have any questions. No, so then I will start, because maybe it's good that on purpose, I chose, let's say, to be moderate because I'm a layperson in this field, at least, completely. So I hope I will ask questions that people also ask themselves. And you mentioned the question of the cemeteries and let's say what the data says about the social group or the elite. So do you have an idea, and what way do you know how deep, let's say, socially these cemeteries go? Which kind of class you're looking at, or are you looking at really a whole community, and how do you assess this in these different periods you're looking at, both with the Avars and with Gepids and heralds that you were looking at? Maybe for both of you.
Let's go chronologically. You talk about late Roman.
Well, I think more or less it's the same, because within the Histogenes project, the idea is to study whole cemeteries, not only elite graves, and not only, let's say, graves of poor or moderately wealthy people. So the idea is to study all graves, and in that case, it goes very deep in social terms, from the elite graves to the, let's say, lower class graves. I think that covers.
Well, what I could add is that on the one hand, of course, in many of these contexts, grave goods and what we find in the graves, and also the depth of the graves, are for distinction. So what we have in the late Roman period is ways in which military, well, no, elite, I don't know whether you could call the federates elite. They're probably not elite. They're sort of one.
Not all of them.
Not all of them, yes. But they're a warrior group that has, as warriors, rising status. Also, in a bit of a contradiction, because on the one hand, they're barbarians, and as barbarians, they're still being despised by much of the Roman population. So they're not us. They're still somehow them, although they defend us. It's complicated. But we have similar complicated phenomena in our societies. And so, of course, they want to demonstrate that there's somebody, and to put a sword into the grave is a sign of this status. It is also a sign of masculinity, and a sign of a particular masculinity, because that's a big difference between the noble Romans, who would never walk through Rome with a sword or a knife. So they have this toga, and they walk, and if you want to go to the Senate and kill Julius Caesar, you have to hide a knife somehow, somewhere, because you don't wear this. So this is the kind of masculinity that is declining in the period we're talking about, and eventually disappearing altogether. So no more togas, but trousers, which are Germanic warrior outfit. And also the habit of walking in the streets with a sword by your side demonstrated you're a free man, you're able to defend yourself. And that goes on for something like 1,200 years once it starts. It's a very different kind of masculinity, and you also want to demonstrate that in death. You're a warrior, you're a proud man, you're not like the people who still live in these late Roman cities and are often still buried without any grave goods or with some dress accessories, a hairpin or something. The late Ava graves we have been studying right now are interestingly different case, because that is, we tried to find out whether between these two cemeteries, Leobersdorf and Mödling, whether Leobersdorf, where the Asians are, is in a way higher status or more military, but it's not. So the one that has more weapons is Vienna Jokergasse, and that's also Europeans, but they sit on the Limes Road, so they have a bit more weapons. The other two communities are totally peaceful. You have no injuries that are from combat, and hardly any weapons, maybe knives. These are not people who want to demonstrate that they're different. Interestingly, they demonstrate that they're actually alike. They wear the same belt sets, griffin symbols. Of course, there is a social difference between the people who wear these belt sets, or to whom you give these belt sets in the grave, and those who do not. So there is a sign of status here. But and I think that is pretty unusual that there are only 10% of the graves in both Leobersdorf and Mödling that have no grave goods at all. So they all get something. None of them get a lot of gold and glitter and precious metals. And it's also women's ornaments are simple. They are glass bead bracelets and earrings, no brooches, apart from a very few, 4 in both cemeteries of these wonderful clasps. So that is a society in which, rather than demonstrating how different you are, you somehow seem to demonstrate, well, I mean, we all belong together. There are ways to find these differences between all these cultures that we study, which early Ava period, amazingly rich graves, and still a lot of graves without grave goods. So there is social change that we can study in this period.
Yeah. I will also add that one problem could be also like Singidunum, that there is a lot of graves that have been looted. So this is also a problem. The same problem also in Viminatium, also that you have also looted the graves. As you see that they have been, damaged, and they have been, taken things from the grave. So this is very difficult to obtain a realistic picture of the graves. But there are some cemeteries like our which are preserved completely. So, and this is the real picture. But for us, which was quite interesting, is that all these cemeteries at Viminatium, we believe that by historical sources that there were no so-called barbarians in the Justinianic era in Viminatium, but they are dated by the material just in Justinianic period, which means that there were not a lot of Roman people to defend the frontier, but they have to engage the people who are, the mercenaries. So, and the same mercenaries have also taken from Illyricum to go to Italy or to go to other fronts but also they are present also in this area. And this is why when we published the Viminatium cemeteries, we saw that there was a very important community which has been dated very well. And the excavation of the Svetinja sites was also very important, because we found this material, who we call Germanic or barbarian, end of the 6th century, very well dated by the coins and by the finds and everything, and a lot of amphorae. And it means that with a lot of amphorae and of course the ceramic that we can link to the so-called Japid ceramic or Langborg ceramic, which are the same with this. They are both presents together and with a high percentage of amphorae, which means that they distributed the goods. And if the goods were in the hands of this community, it means that they have a very important place in the society at the end of the 6th century. But by the sources, we don't know that they exist, that they are there, but we know that the Romans are here, but we know there are some people who are practically not they are not the Romans, as I said Romans, but because all the cemeteries, like the cemeteries in Čarećingrad or some cemeteries that we have recently excavated near Kruševac, where of the 6th century, there is no remains of nothing in these 6th century cemeteries, which means that these are Romans and these are completely different. And you see, this is why we produce this map. You can see that when you put all these finds, which we call barbaric, they are only on the rivers and the big cities, because there is a wealth there already. Maybe also they are also engaged in the taxes, to pay the taxes, which is because the river was always the front, and there was also the goods, exchange of goods all the time was the Danube. So they also take the role of the Roman Empire to control this kind of trade between the two parts. So there is a lot of things, but the problem is the scarce of the historical sources for Illyricum, and we have only the sources of archaeology, which can be interpreted in different ways, as we can show that, or how we can interpret it. We hope that this new analysis of genetic will give me more data about that. But the other way, we have also problem, because the most important cemeteries from the Minacium has been reburied. So we don't have the material, anthropological. So they are lost for science. And we have excellent material, but it's lost for science. And so this is the problem, that when we excavate, we have to keep all the finds all the time, because the science is going really rapidly, really rapidly growing up, and we are taking a lot of so many things, because we haven't spoke about that, because in this project also there is also isotopic analysis, which gives also a lot of new data about also the health, the pestis, also the plague and everything. So this project is a really, really huge one, and this is only one small part of the project that has been presented tonight.
So maybe if there are questions from the audience about the research, one of the two talks, or something related, don't be shy. You can also, of course, ask in Serbian if you want. Somebody or me who will translate if there is something. Yes, please.
I'm Vladimir, and I have a question regarding the pending paper about your findings. So if I understood you well, we can expect many new archaeogenetic results soon. So I think I heard that 250 from Serbia. And how many from other countries? Can you?
So it's more than 6,000. Actually, it's almost 7,000 now, of which most of the samples have already been taken. But of course, it is a long process. First, the sequencing. So they have these wonderful robots in Leipzig that can analyze and sequence 100 samples at the same time. But of course, then what takes a lot of time is all the bioinformatic analysis, and you have to try so many things, because these are all new methods, and they have never been applied to such huge material. That takes some time, but of course these are also in the field of genetics. These are very new things, so we've already published in Nature and in Cell, and we're submitting to these top-level scientific journals, which for us historians and archaeologists is of course something new and a bit strange, because these are 6 to 8 page articles, so you have to stuff everything that is really important into a few pages. And then you have a lot of supplements where all the material and the arguments and the literature are cited. And that can be 100 pages. So it's actually like writing a book, but the essence of the book is in these 6 pages. So very different from us. And it actually goes very fast. So they publish very quickly. And online, usually also. And of course, we hope that these top-level journals will not lose interest in Avars, Goths, and Longobards, etc. The article of, so I hope that both that the article about Leobersdorf and another one, which is about Hungarian sites, both sides of the Tisza River, will come out this year. And then there will, one article that is also already on a good way is about the Slovenian find. So we have a transect study about Slovenia, which goes from late Roman graves in Celeja, Celje, actually to 9th century graves. Then there will be a study about the Little Hungarian Plain, which is probably both sides of the Danube. The Slovaks don't like it if you call it Little Hungarian Plain for obvious reasons. The Hungarians call it like that. But that is mainly also 5th and 6th century, and a lot of limes forts and some very interesting sites that were used both in the pre-Avar and the Avar period. And then of course we have material from Thüringen and Saxony in East Germany. And that's interesting to see whether between those Germans, Longobards especially, that live in the 6th century in the Carpathian Basin, and between people who lived in Thüringen in the 5th century, is there a direct connection? Are these people who actually come from the region, which according to historical sources we might assume? So we're very curious. And also, of course, there are 8th, 9th century Slavic graves, which is interesting. Is that are Slavs in Eastern Germany in any way different to Slavs in Slovenia or Serbia? Or, of course, Eastern Austria? We hope, well, there will be a lot of articles in the coming 3-4 years, and they should be accessible through our website, which I think I had on my last slide, which was only on briefly. So if you look for histo genes, that's easy to find.
Thank you. I can't wait for the results.
Fine. Anything else? Any other questions? Because otherwise I would... please, Pep.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentation. I'm very intrigued by the story about Avars. And are they related in any way to the Avars of the Caucasus? Or it's just a coincidence?
Chances are that this is just a coincidence, because there are kind of Avar-type names are already exist in that region, north of Iran, in the Roman or Sasanian period, or even previously. So there is a tradition of its own. So of course that is a problem that we always have with these roughly steppe peoples, because the name Huns, which is also in Indian Brahmi sources, Hun, or Iranian sources, you never know whether that is actually a sort of general term for rather different types of steppe peoples, or whether this has anything really ethnic about it. Like the Romans who kept calling Huns, Avars, and later even the Hungarians Scythians. Like the ancient Scythians who had long ago disappeared. So
they were Iranian people, right?
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, present-day Avars speak different language, not Turkic language like we know that our, let's say, historical Avars.
Yes,
Caucasian.
Caucasian.
So it's quite different.
Of course, we don't know what language the Avars spoke, but probably.
But there are some, Mennonites and Miklos and this Turkic.
It is Turkic
probably
runes.
Turkic.
Well, the two important Hungarian philologists, András Vonatas and István Vázsari, one says it's Mongolian and the other says it's Turkic. But
okay. Thank you for the reply.
So I have one maybe more question to wrap it up and to go back to the, to this thing you mentioned in terms of publishing and going to different journals. It's a different sort of scientific culture. It's I guess something where you have to look at the story you're telling also much more. I mean, I come from a different background, but I know in physics many people also try, and some of them succeed to publish in Nature. And it's a very specific way for every discipline, I guess, to go into this supra-discipline journals. So I just wanted to ask you, and then also maybe connect to the whole ERC, because this is also something where you have to tell a story to people who assess you, and in the end, the ones who assess you at the last stage, they cannot be from your own discipline, because of course you have your peers, but at some point you have to make a choice between a project in chemistry and a project in history and so on. So at some point you're competing with the other disciplines, and going to these big journals is a part of it. So I wanted to ask you, is this something that also for you that you feel comfortable with? Is it something that at some point you have to do, to break through and get the funding? And you mentioned already some of the concrete things of how you do it and how you have to do it. Is this something that students and so on should start working on from the beginning, or is it something that is coming later in a career and more with let's say management positions once you're in this field, or is it something that actually you should learn from the very beginning, scientific English and so on and so forth?
Well, I mean, you do learn a lot, but it also creates a lot of problems. So one problem, of course, is that publications in Nature, Science, etc., there are 26 authors plus minus, so it's a long list of authors. Of course, there is a main author in the beginning and maybe a second main author with an asterisk marked. And it's usually decided by the first one. And the ones in the end are also quite important, and the ones in the middle have given a few finds that you have studied. So, and that is very difficult for the archaeologists, or also for the historians, because for them, if they invest a lot of work in such an article in Nature, and they're the 12th author on the list or something, then that doesn't help them. Whereas, on the other hand, so we also talked, well, we also have to publish in archaeological journals. And there's even a journal of archaeological science, which is quite prominent among archaeologists. But then the geneticist said, oh no, that's not going to do any good. For a PhD in archaeogenetics who really wants to make a career, it's got to be the top-notch journals. So it's got to be Science, Nature, or Cell. And then there's a sort of second tier, which is the proceedings of the National Academy of Science and a few more. And the rest, then there's +1, which is where all the rubbish goes from the point of view of the, I mean, this is how the big heads in Johannes Krause talk about it. You can't waste any of our good research on +1. And for them, archaeological journals come even below +1, and historical journals, probably English Historical Review or whatever, they don't exist. So that doesn't help anybody. The second problem is that, of course, geneticists panic because they might be scooped. And I actually learned that you can talk among scholars about being scooped. So somebody publishes about similar material 2 months before you, and you're out. Even if it's slightly different material, but the same conclusion, or the same material and slightly different conclusion, that's no good. And what also doesn't work is to sort of say, it's very complicated, people thought it was very easy, and I'm going to show you that it's much more complicated than we tended to think, which is something that I like doing as a historian. And I think it's what we as historians have learned in the last decades. These are the things that are actually have made up much of the progress in the historical disciplines since the 1960s, 1970s, to say, oh, it's not just Romans against barbarians. It's much more complicated because there are barbarians who are Romanized to an extent, and if they talk to Romans, they can be perfect Romans, and if they talk to barbarians, they can still try to be the perfect barbarian. Different people perceive of this in different ways. So an argument like this would have no chance on the planet to be published in any top scientific journals. In the scientific journals, you need to come up with a title that already says it all. So you may have noticed it. Sophisticated archaeogenetic analysis proves that elite Avars came from East and Central Asia, full stop. And then you have an abstract of a few sentences, extended title or short abstract, in which you also make one strong claim after the other. And if you can't make any strong claims, they call it narrative, these strong claims. We have now proved beyond a reasonable doubt that it is. And you can say it in 20 seconds. And I, as a historian, if somebody asks me, say it in 20 seconds, and you can see from my answers to questions that I can't say anything in 20 seconds, then we're lost. So we learn a lot, and I know that I have to adapt because I want also to put my historical narratives into these papers, which actually the geneticists like, because that is for them also a mark of distinction. We have history and archaeology on board in this article. It's more than just genetics. So they like that, but this is amazing amount of work. So the one article, 8 pages that we're writing, is already occupying me for 3 months, full time. No, not full time, but it's a lot of effort that goes into it. But it's a fascinating experience, and I mean, young people should actually, I think, if they can, try to go through that school. And the young people in our project certainly have to.
Something more from you? Otherwise, I would thank you again very much for the insights into your research, ongoing research, and I'm sure we'll hear new things in the future, and I'm looking forward to it. Unfortunately, I will not be here in this function, but I will try to come back from time to time and maybe also catch one of the talks. Thank you for being here. There is an opportunity still to discuss a little bit with a glass of liquid, whatever that is. I don't know, wine and juice or something like this. I hope it's not too warm by this time. But thank you for being here, and this closes the first. I'm sure, very successful Science Cafe Austria-Serbia. Thank you very much.